universe and the age of the universe. Is it polite if the universe is claiming to be about 6,000 years old to confront it and say, we know the truth, you're really 15 billion years? You know, some of us sometimes like to lie a little bit or be creative about our age. What is the Big Bang Theory? Why do some people consider it to be religiously problematic? And why do I and many other people feel that in fact it isn't religiously problematic? Although there are many seeming contradictions, sometimes the best way to resolve these contradictions is to bring the person to realize that in fact there's no problem to begin with. In order to do that, though, you have to present them with many, many, many answers to all the questions they have. And then suddenly, rather than having many questions with many answers, everything falls away and you realize there was no question to begin with. I don't know if we can accomplish that in 45 minutes or an hour, but I hope to give you enough material to be able to really understand the basics of Big Bang Theory and the religious attitudes towards it.
If you believe in the Bereshit story, and you accept that there's a God who's all-powerful, then also God could have created exactly like it says in Bereshit. He could have said, Vayihi Or, God can create vocal cords, create airwaves. He can do everything as it says, literally, 100% literally, in the Bereshit story, if that's what you want. If God is all-powerful, God could do that. God could then, after the 6 days of creation, put everything into a logical, physical state. And that's how you can interpret Shabbos. Shabbos is the creation of the laws of nature, putting everything into the way that a scientist would have said it would be, and then letting it go according to those laws of nature. That's what it means God rested. God rested means he now did not have to control directly every little event and every blade of grass moving, but he created laws of nature to do that. It's the same thing. You can say that God every minute caused the blade of grass to move, or it's God's law of nature that causes it to move. It's the same thing, just using different words. So it's not that we cannot interpret literally the words of Bereshit. You can interpret 100% literally.
And in fact, it's even possible if God is all-powerful and desires to do things this way, God could have created the universe exactly as it says in Genesis. Maybe God does see and does talk, and he created things in 6 days, and then put it all together in a way which would be consistent with the Big Bang Theory. That's certainly possible. It could be. Do I think that? Not necessarily.
God creates it in actuality, right? With the light, spreading, splitting, exactly as it says in Bereshit. Literally, he says with vocal cords, with air, however fundamentalist and literal you want to be, it's okay. And then at the end of the 7th day, or on the 7th day, and the 6th day, whatever, on Shabbos, he says, okay, let me take this creation that I've made with all these pieces, and let me create everything in a system that works by itself. Okay, so again, you can read Bereshit totally literally. Nothing contradicts science whatsoever, because the end result will be a universe exactly as we know it now, which predicts this equation, which if you would take it all the way back, would predict the existence of the Big Bang. Did that Big Bang really exist or not? did time really start only in a middle point where God kind of then created laws of nature? That's not something that even interests science, because you can't make a prediction about it. The universe is now in such a way that when you look at the universe, you make the measurements, you make predictions, this is what you get. Which, if you predict backwards, gives you a Big Bang. Based on that, you can make assumptions, you can make predictions, which you can measure the microwave background radiation. Whether it really happened that way, or God fiddled with it along the way and made it be that way, is not of interest to science. And if you say it that way, you can say it that way if you want. It has nothing. Even a person who believes that God made it in the literal way and then fiddled with it to make it into the universe that we know now, still will find this very interesting, because God created this equation. God made the universe so that it fits this equation. And presumably we can learn a lot of interesting things if we do that. If I create, that's what I will need in order to produce everything that I want. Let there be a Big Bang.
One sentence. God said, let there be a Big Bang.
Right.
Right?
The article, I'll give you another literal interpretation. When does the first point of the creation, when is the first point of the existence of the universe, if you believe, like Bereshit, that there's a God who created the universe? If you create something, what is the first instant of the existence of that creation? Tell me, whenever you made something. What is it? Okay, when it's finished. And in reverse, when is the first instant that you can say that that thing exists in some level? You have the idea. You have the concept in your head. Now, clearly, we believe that God, although it says, by Yar Kitov, he did this, he wasn't like tinkering. We don't think that he was tinkering. He said, oh, well, this is good, okay, I'll do it, right? We believe that basically there was a plan. And it was in order to give rise to a certain kind of universe in which there will be beings who will be able to choose between good and evil. They'll have intelligence to be able to learn the consequences of their actions and to foresee what it's going to be and to make a choice. That's a very complex kind of universe. Not every Big Bang that you would create will give rise to that kind of universe. All right? You have to fine-tune a lot of the constants of nature to produce matter, certainly to produce complex entities. So in order to produce the Big Bang, certainly God would have had to think very carefully, so to speak, about, well, what kind of laws of nature should I create? What kind of universe? How many dimensions of space and time? And how should they be wired together? What should I create as the Big Bang and the laws of nature? In order that they should, a human being should emerge. Or if I want to create things in an ad hoc way, and then I want to create laws of nature, which we know exist now, what kind of laws of nature should I create on the seventh day so that they can take over and run things the way we know that they kind of run things now? So there's a lot of thought. So first you would probably have to start with, what you said, the end. You have the end result. Right? So you start with the human being. You start with the idea that you want to create an entity that can make a free choice between good and evil. From that follows a whole universe in which there will be now moral challenges. From that follows the specifications, what kind of space and time, and how you wire space and time, and how many dimensions, and what kind of laws of nature there will have to be in order for all this to exist. That's what you have to have before you even start and say, Yehi Or. Right? So maybe the Bereshit story is a literal description, so to speak, in human terms, of the creation of that blueprint. Right? Because that's when creation really starts. When God is thinking, okay, I'll have this, okay, there'll be light, right? And I'll have this, okay, and I'll make waters, and I'll split that, and of course these things have much more deeper meaning than just waters, but if you want to read purely literally, and okay, now what I'll do is, yes, okay, I'll do that, I'll do this, and then God says, okay, now I'm going to create laws of nature which will all do that. And say, aha, that's the Big Bang that I have to create. If I create, that's what I will need in order to produce everything that I want. Let there be a Big Bang.
And what is this age of 6,000 years? Do you know that nowhere in the Bible does it say that the universe is 6,000 years old? Nowhere does Abraham say, X thousand years ago when the universe was created. Nowhere does God, when he's speaking to many of the prophets, say, 3,000 years ago when I created the universe. Nowhere does that date appear. Nowhere. In the Talmud, I'm not an expert in all of Talmud, I don't think that they really talk about this. There are mentions of cycles of time, 6,000 years and 7,000 years, but there are many cycles. And Kabbalistic lore has many, many allusions to millions of years and billions of years of all kinds of different cycles. It doesn't seem as though anybody really took seriously the date of 6,000 years. So how did it come about? If you count up from the time of Adam, and you see, well, how long did he live, and how old was he when he gave birth to his son, and how old was his son when he gave birth to him, and etc., etc. You count up all the days, and you get 6,000 years. But that's only if you accept certain things as very literal. Clearly, the first and second story of Adam and Eve are very, very different, and there are very good reasons why. And one should not just simply understand them in a totally literal way as talking about ordinary time and so on.
You can say Bereshit clearly is not meant at the literal level. Not that God couldn't do it that way, but that's not what it means. And that's not what we're intended to think that it means. And nobody ever thought that that's what it means, because nobody ever thought that God did this, and the two stories clearly are meant to show us that they're contradicting if you read them so overly literally. So it means something differently. And in fact, yes, God created the Big Bang, just like this equation says. And everything in between. It's very interesting that wherever you look through in the Bible, in the whole Tanakh, you never find, as far as I know, one mention of the age of the universe. The Torah starts out with Genesis, and never, ever, ever mentions 2,000 years after creation, such and such happened. Never. If you look, again, as far as I know, through the Talmud, you may find discussions of cycles of the universe being 6,000 years, and there are cycles of the universe in the Kabbalah spoken of in millions of years and billions of years also. No one seems to take this as the date of creation. The only way that you arrive at this number is by counting up, like, how old was Adam when he gave birth to this one, how old was this one when he gave birth to that one, and so on and so forth, and you add up and you get to 6,000 years. But no one seemed to take this date to be an actual real date. You have the famous, like, 400 and some years ago, etc., etc. So Abraham Lincoln was referring to past times, like given a certain amount. You'll never find, for example, a Roman referring to that's still talking about the year such and such for the creation. Nobody in the whole Torah, as far as I can figure it, I think even in Gemara, ever refers to like the age of the universe the way we count it. It's relatively modern invention to talk, let's say, to put it in the tuba and so on, how many years it is from the creation of the world. It doesn't mean that it's not correct. I'm saying that the whole thing, the whole problem, so to speak, may be just some kind of a false thing. Maybe we're not even supposed to believe that the universe is literally in that age. Maybe we do. But nobody ever used that age. Nobody. You'll never see it. You'll never see it now. You'll never see it. I'm not sure. Maybe 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago. It's clear. It's not clear at all that that's how we're supposed to understand Bereshit, that we can add up these numbers together.
Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, this is the way it's usually translated, everybody's familiar with it. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Right? You open up the Bible anywhere in the world, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. That is not necessarily the actual translation. The classical commentaries, the Jewish commentaries, point out that in Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim doesn't make sense. It's grammatically, like in English, you would say, in the beginning created. It's the wrong, it doesn't work. Either in the beginning God created, or in the beginning of the creation or something. You can't say in the beginning created. It doesn't work. And they point out, therefore, that there must be a different reading. And the reading that they choose is Bereshit bara Elohim, not Bereshit bara. There's no dots in the Torah. You've ever seen the Torah scroll. There's no punctuation. And they say it's Bereshit bara. What does that mean? In the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, when the earth was void and formless, then God said, let there be light, and there was light. Not in the beginning God created everything. In other words, there's some kind of a process that's ongoing, and we don't know the actual beginning of. Right away, the very first word and the second word, the conjunction, give us this big secret that it's not necessarily talking about the actual very beginning. In addition, the commentaries point out an alternate interpretation. How could it be Bereshit bara? If you don't read it Bereshit bara, but you actually read it Bereshit bara. And they show that what it means is, for Reshit did God create. And what is Reshit? And in Reshit, they prove, means various things, the people of Israel, the land of Israel, all kinds of things. In other words, Reshit bara doesn't mean in the beginning God created, but for those things that are called Reshit did God create the world. In other words, Genesis is not trying to tell us about how the universe was created, but why the universe was created. It's the meaning, it's the purpose of things, not the mechanical way or the time when it happened. And these are totally, fully fundamental, traditional interpretations. In other words, there is no necessity to accept the idea that the universe is 6,000. We can't. It's a legitimate Jewish interpretation of Genesis. But it's certainly not the interpretation, and it certainly wasn't everybody's interpretation, and the number never even came up in the literature until probably recently. Now, I mentioned before about God seeing, and God saying, and so on, and God stretching out his hand and taking the Jewish people out of Egypt. Nobody here, I imagine, really believes that it means that in a physical sense. And Maimonides and various other Jewish philosophers spoke at length about how one should interpret the creation story and the Garden of Eden story, not because it contradicted science, but because it was obvious to them that it didn't mean this, in a way, childish, simplistic, naive interpretation that people were giving. And just as in the time of Copernicus, people made assumptions, projected their own ideas of what Genesis meant, and that the Torah said that the sun is the center, the earth is the center of the universe, which it didn't really say, or it said it only in a poetic way, and then they created some kind of alleged controversy and contradiction between science and religion that didn't really exist, even according to the scientists who discovered the theory. And the same thing, in a way, happened, but in reverse with Einstein. Einstein came up with this theory and rejected it because it sounded too religious. So it was just the opposite. So I would certainly not say that there is a contradiction, there is a problem, and there are many resolutions, but there really isn't a problem.
The Jewish conception of Bereshit is not the literal English translation meaning. And there's a much more even radical Jewish conception of Bereshit. What is the translation of the first two words? Bereshit, bara, Elohim. What is the translation of those words? In every English Chumash you open up, what does it say? In the beginning, God created him. That is not the true Jewish interpretation of those words. If you look at the first Rashi, you'll see he brings Mufarshim. Will clearly state that grammatically that is not possible. Bereshit is a construct. It's Bereshit bri'at shamayim ba'aretz, or Bereshit bro Elokim shamayim ba'aretz. You cannot say in Hebrew, and he proves it from the Polish. You cannot say Bereshit bara. It doesn't make sense. It's in the beginning of created God. It doesn't work. Grammatically, it just doesn't work. So you have to read it differently. And he brings two possibilities. One, Bereshit bro Elokim shamayim ba'aretz. In the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, when everything was darkness and void and this and that, that's when God said, let there be light. In other words, it's not talking about that initial beginning instant. It's talking about in the beginnings of that, when things were like this, not in the beginning God created heaven. A totally radically different interpretation of Bereshit. That is not some strange interpretation, but according to Rashi, and Rashi is not making things up, he's bringing things from before, and those are presumably what Moshe Rabbeinu taught, that Bereshit shouldn't be read the way we're taught in these English translations. It's something else. It's not talking about necessarily that initial beginning point. Maybe it is at a deep level. Another interpretation that's brought there is Bir Reshit, Avur Reshit, for those things called Reshit, Bara Elokim Hashemayim Ba'aretz. What are those things called? Reshit, Teruah, Israel, and so on. In other words, what's the point here? Bereshit bara Elokim means for those things called Reshit did God create heavens and earth. In other words, it's telling us why the universe was created, not how or when and how long. again, the fact that here it says one day and there's like 6 days, it's obvious to us that God doesn't talk. Clearly, God doesn't work for 6 days and the rest. These things are very deep, and we have to keep Shabbos on the 7th day for very deep reasons. But it doesn't mean the exact literal translation, or we don't have to believe that that's the only way to interpret it. There are many, many, many other ways to interpret it. When you look at Genesis, the very first word, it says, Bereshit bara Elokim. As all the commentators have pointed out, this is grammatically has no meaning. Hebrew cannot be constructed in such a way, Bereshit bara. It's Bereshit bro Elokim shamayim va'aretz, or Bereshit briat shamayim va'aretz. There's no Bereshit bara. It just doesn't. It's in the beginning created, not in the beginning of the creation or in the beginning God created. It just doesn't hang. And therefore, many of the commentaries, including the very first Rashi and Bereshit, mentions that it should be Bereshit bro Elokim. And you'll find in the modern translations, for example, I think the Jewish translation of the Torah, Jewish translations, you'll see this. Not the famous, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. No. In the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, when the earth was void and formless and darkness was hovering over the face of the earth, God said, let there be light. Okay? A construct. That gives a totally different interpretation of Bereshit. It doesn't mean we're talking about the beginning. We're talking about in the beginning of things. Now, there's other ways of looking at this. As I mentioned before, the Big Bang Theory and all scientific conceptions in general neglect deliberately certain aspects of reality that religious people consider to be the most basic and fundamental. Meaning and purpose, love, spirituality, the mind. Those things are totally not in the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory does not make any mention of any of those. The Big Bang Theory is a naturalistic theory of how the physical universe originates. Now, it says in the Genesis account that God created mankind out of the earth. Now, are we earth? If you go to a hospital, they open up and take out dirt or blood. They take out, there's no earth. You don't, when you pass through an x-ray, maybe the scanner downstairs, if you walk through, which you're not supposed to, into the actual x-ray machine, will they see earth? If they look at a woman, will they see like a male rib inside? No. So clearly, when did anybody ever think that this was? At the time that the Torah was given at Sinai, did people really think, oh, okay, then inside we're earth? No. Nobody ever thought that that's what it meant. That's not what it means. So what does it mean that God made man out of earth? What did he do then? Clearly, after he took the earth and made a snowman out of earth, he must have turned it all into flesh and blood and cells and genes and stuff like that. Right? How did he do that? Well, it doesn't tell us. Maybe through evolution. Maybe through the Big Bang and evolution. He took the earth and turned it into a human being. We don't know how. It doesn't say how he did it. And clearly, we're not earth. Clearly, at some point, we were turned into this. So maybe science is telling us the mechanism whereby this happened. And what it's trying to tell us, again, are the deep things. How, why God created, for what purpose God created. And those are exactly the things that science does not touch. Science does not deal with the meaning of life, does not deal with the purpose of life, does not deal with our emotions and all the great things that make life meaningful. It's two separate things. They both touch on very, very deep things. Science is trying to find out things about the universe from its perspective, those things that everybody can agree on, and it's a beautiful thing. The Chinese communists and that proverbial Satmar Chassid, they're both coming up with these same equations and making the same predictions. It has nothing to do with your philosophy. All you have to do is make certain assumptions about the physical universe, and you come up with these equations. Then you have implications of these equations, and then you can deal with the implications.
One can certainly see from the religious perspective that understanding the nature of the universe through the perspective of meaning and purpose and free will choice puts a totally different light even on the Big Bang Theory, even on the question of how the universe emerged into existence. One can even have the whole Big Bang Theory
And not only to say, well, God created the Big Bang, but when you see it in the light of Genesis as being created in order to produce a free-willed moral being, you can even tie it to the theory to explain why there is anything at all, how the Big Bang actually emerged into existence. And I think it's important in general to be able to see all these different perspectives, just like we have multiculturalism in the United States and so on, and that enriches us in many ways. The creation account and the scientific theories of the universe enrich each other. We understand more about the creation account when we know about science, and we know what isn't. And we maybe know more about the Big Bang Theory when we can view it and infuse it with a deeper understanding of why the Big Bang existed. What is the purpose of existence as a whole? Thank you. There are many, 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 many different approaches. There's a tremendous literature about this. And the literature is Jewish and non-Jewish. People have been talking about this idea of the age of the universe for over 150 years, since the time that geologists found the Earth was millions of years old. By that time, they didn't know it was billions, but it was millions of years old, and they realized that there's some kind of discrepancy. And that's when this whole thing about the age of the universe came up. It never was an issue before. As far as I'm concerned, it's still not an issue. But people have made it into an issue. And again, very, very ironically so, attaching it to the theory of the Big Bang. Now, there are many ways, there are many attempts to read Bereshit literally. Nevertheless, those are also consistent. You could do that. And in fact, those started 150 years ago when geologists first found that the Earth is several millions of years old. Immediately, the Christian geologists came with various theories to explain how it could be that the Bereshit story is like this and it's millions of years. And what they came up with, among other things, were that the 6 days of creation were 6 epochs. The thing which you hear nowadays from Jewish writers was already written about 150 years ago by Christians who were trying to reconcile geological findings with the long pre-Bang, pre-Big Bang, and evolution ideas of geology. Then when evolution came about, you had, again, Christian writings about the same thing. I was personally interested in this whole idea, and I came up with several ideas, and then I did some research and read some old books and found that some of the ideas I'd come up with were 150 years old. People independently come up with all kinds of ideas to explain these seeming discrepancies between Genesis and the age of the Earth and the age of the universe, evolution, and so on and so forth. One of these ideas is that the 6 days of creation aren't days. It's a day, it says in Tehillim, in the Psalms, a day is like 1,000 years, and so on and so forth. There are statements in the Kabbalah very clearly saying that the universe is billions of years old, or millions of years old, different kinds of cycles. There are all kinds of statements in Jewish tradition. Which particular way one meshes these things, if one tries to find an equation which shows that from God's viewpoint, 6 days is actually 15 billion years, it's very nice. There are many, many different ways of doing it, and again, I've given a number of references for people who would like to look at it. And these ideas, by the way, appeared 100 years ago as well. When people were talking about the ages of the universe, rather than 6 days, they talked about 6 epochs. And they divided 6 eras of time, and they made these parallels. There's a book by Carl Sagan, who was a planetary scientist, and maybe many of you have seen his shows. And he has in one of his books, I think maybe it's a Cosmic Connection, or I'm not sure which book it is, he has a diagram of periods, eras of time. And it was very clear to many people that one can draw these parallels. There are several anomalies. For example, you have vegetation before the sun. How could it be that there's vegetation before the sun? Of course, well, if there's an omnipotent God who can do whatever he wants, he can make vegetation before the sun. You can answer it that way. Or you can say that it's allegorical. Or you could say that the sun shone through the atmosphere. Not that the sun was created before, but the atmosphere didn't allow sun to come through. And this is one of the ways that, for example, Eliezer and various other people explain these things. So you can explain in many, many, many different approaches. And the more you look, you find that these approaches abound, and that whatever approach there is kind of like a recycling of something that existed in some other form previously 150 years ago when geologists first came up with the idea that the Earth is more than what some people thought was the biblical age of the Earth. Looked at the Big Bang Theory and Genesis and tried to overcome those things that seem to bother some people, for example, the age of the Universe. There are many, some of the references that I've given in this little sheet for the reading. My conception of the written Torah, the way I understand it and explain it to people, is that the written Torah is a subset of the oral Torah and not the reverse. The Jewish people had a tradition before they received the written Torah. They had tradition from Abraham, they had traditions all along until the time that they received the Torah. Along with the Torah came interpretations of what the Torah is all about. And there are secret teachings which form the Kabbalah, which were never written then. All this is the oral Torah. The written Torah is a subset of that. And to understand the written Torah, you have to look at the oral Torah. And it's very clear when you're reading Midrash and Kabbalah and so on and so forth, that people did not understand these things in a literal sense. Again, that does not mean that it's false. It doesn't mean that one should ignore it. It's very, very, very deep things. To a child, you can say, God saw, God said, God stretched out his arm and took us out of Egypt. And a child has whatever imagery they have of that. We know we have a different vision of that. And if you think deeply into it, you can let go a childlike acceptance of some of the other things that we have, which maybe people haven't really thought deeply about. When you're trying to figure out what is the structure of the universe, and you're not taking into account anything other than gravity, are you leaving something out? For example, human beings, love, life, meaning, purpose, spirituality, art, literature, philosophy. Are those important somehow to describing the universe? Or are those just incidentals that arise out of a naturalistic universe? Humans arise, and the natural activity of humans is to engage in those kinds of things. Or is that something fundamental to the universe, something that tells us something basic about the universe, and if our theories of the universe don't take into account, maybe we're missing something very fundamental. And one can certainly see from the religious perspective that understanding the nature of the universe through the perspective of meaning and purpose and free will choice puts a totally different light even on the Big Bang Theory. Even on the question of how the universe emerged into existence. One can even have the whole Big Bang Theory, and not only say, well, God created the Big Bang, but when you see it in the light of Genesis as being created in order to produce a free-willed moral being, you can even tie it into the theory to explain why there is anything at all, how the Big Bang actually emerged into existence. The religious conception of the universe is that the universe was created as an act of will by a conscious entity for a purpose. Humans are created in the image of this divine entity, whatever that means. And the purpose of the creation of the universe is intimately tied to human activity, maybe the activity of other races elsewhere, we don't know. Clearly, that may have fundamental implications for how the universe came into being. For example, there's a very interesting speculation within quantum physics It's more quantum metaphysics in a sense. It's not possible to go in this short time into this whole theory. There's a lot of literature about it if you'd like to read. According to some interpretations, it's necessary for the human mind to actually observe something in order for things to achieve the kind of reality status that human minds talk about.
Now there's a very interesting conception in quantum physics. It has to do with the measurement problem, and I won't go into that because it's a very, very difficult and speculative and somewhat controversial topic as well. Some approaches to quantum physics, or maybe you can even call it quantum metaphysics, speculate that it's necessary for human consciousness to exist in order to what's called collapsed wave function, if you've heard the term, in order to bring things into the full reality. Because quantum physics is a very, very fascinating subject, and it says some very weird things, just like general relativity teaches about how space can curve and so on. It says some very fundamental things about the nature of reality, and it may be that, in fact, a human consciousness is necessary in order to bring things into what human consciousness observes as reality. And Professor Wheeler, who's a very eminent physicist, came up with the idea, which is very speculative, that if the universe as a whole is a physical entity, and if physical entities require an observer at some point, then how would the universe itself come into existence if observers only evolve later on? And he came up with a very beautiful concept that the universe emerges into existence, it evolves, and eventually, after some time, there evolves within a human being with consciousness, awareness, that's able to observe the universe. And this then, in some sense, retroactively gives existence to the beginning of the universe, allows the universe to emerge.
One of the most prominent physicists, Wheeler, whose book I have over here, applied that to the universe as a whole and said, well, how is it that we have a physical universe? It must be that there were observers, conscious observers at some point, to observe the universe in order to bring it into the physical state that we observe today. And his radical conception was that the eventual emergence of observers, of conscious entities, seeing and consciously aware of the universe, is what gives reality to the universe all the way back to the beginning. You have the universe developing over time, eventually giving rise to an observer who then observes the initiation of the universe, thereby giving it reality retroactively. An article that I wrote applied Wheeler's idea to the creation account. We have the eventual emergence of human beings. The Eden story tells us how humans acquired free will, basically, became conscious observers and chose. And I illustrated it with Wheeler's illustration. This journal just came out recently. It's Bahar Torah, and I have an article in there, and the title of the article is "And God Said, Let There Have Been a Big Bang," which ties into this whole thing that I discussed about the retroactive emergence and so on. On this sheet, you have information about how to get the magazine. My article itself is actually available on the web. You can find it.
Yeah, I downloaded it.
Not only is there neurological disability, ways of looking at it.
It'll be a sex organization. They don't want a sex.
Understanding
Now, scientific theory generally looks at the universe in a reductionist materialist way. What does that mean? Is the fact that humans have produced works of art or literature or even science, does that tell us something fundamental about the universe? So the way science looks at things now, at least, mostly they would say no. The universe is a physical thing, and there's particles, and there's physics, there's chemistry, stuff like that. And eventually, humans evolve on some planet, and maybe other aliens evolve on some other planet. And that's a side effect of the universe, and beavers build dams, and humans create art. It doesn't tell us anything about the universe. And how do we know about the universe? We know by testing things, by experiments, and so on, by rational. Now, this is a very beautiful idea because science limits itself only to those things that can be agreed upon in an objective manner, whether there is an orthodox Hasidic physicist somewhere in Brooklyn or a Chinese communist in Beijing. They will agree about science. They may not agree about politics or about religion or about economics. They will agree about science. And science limits itself deliberately to those things that are true irrespective of your particular personal beliefs, which is a very, very nice thing, and it's very efficient. I mean, if you can build light bulbs, obviously you know something about light. You know something about electricity. You have a pretty good idea of the universe. If you can send rockets to Mars, you obviously have some kind of good idea about the universe. If you can make a prediction that the universe is expanding and measure this redshift that I was talking about, this light, like the ambulance waves, you obviously know something about the universe. The question is, are you missing something fundamental? Maybe, maybe not. To religion, in particular to the Bible, the purpose of the universe is what's of overriding importance. And the purpose of the universe clearly has to do with moral activity, with free will choice, with love, and not with just mechanical interactions. And certainly from the Torah perspective, I would imagine that if you totally ignore that which is the purpose of the universe, you are going to have a fundamentally flawed understanding of the universe, maybe even in its physical aspect. Maybe not. Now, the Big Bang Theory and the theory of evolution, which is not the topic tonight, I think fit in totally, in any case, with Genesis, in the sense that God says, for example, God produced mankind from the dirt, from the dust. Now, are we dust? If you slash yourself, God forbid, is dust coming? If you take an x-ray of the women who are here, will you find a man's rib inside? No one really believes that. So if God fashioned us from the dust, what does that mean? What does it mean that God took us and He made of dust like a snowman out of dust? And then what? We're not dust. Obviously, as part of that process, God must have turned that dust into cells, into flesh and bones, into blood. How did He do that? By what mechanism? We're not told. Maybe because it's not important for religion that we have to know. Maybe it's important for science, but not for religion. Science can teach us how that happened. Maybe it happened through the process of evolution. God created a universe and laws of nature designed to produce humanity, designed to produce humans with intelligence, and then at the appropriate stage of evolution, breathe within them the spirit which gave them a soul. Whatever that means, and that's not something that science can deal with. Science doesn't see a soul, doesn't know about a soul, doesn't deal with a soul. So there's absolutely no reason to see them as contradiction. It's maybe an explanation of what's happening in Genesis, and the same thing with the Big Bang Theory. How did God create the universe? What does it mean, let there be light? Let there be light, maybe let there be this energy. Whatever, many people have written many books and articles showing parallels. What are the 6 days? The 6 days are eras in the creation of the universe, and there are various well-defined eras. And you can find a vast literature on all these things. Now, in conclusion, basically, how would you expect a scientific theory of the universe to differ from a religious theory of the universe? A scientific theory of the universe we spoke about when we said it will focus only on those things which are objective, which are materialistic, which are naturalistic, where there's cause and effect and so on. I don't see a soul. You go to the hospital, nobody ever measures your soul. Nobody ever tells you whether your soul is in good shape or not in good shape. You may go to a religious, functionary for that or not, but you're certainly not going to find that in the medical sciences or the other sciences. That doesn't mean that the soul doesn't exist. Science doesn't deal with those kinds of things. And it constructs beautiful theories that can be verified without those kinds of things. And therefore it's very productive for science to neglect those kinds of things. Because if you said, well, everything happens because God wishes it to happen, You'll never find out anything. You'll never build a light bulb. You'll never go to Mars. You'll never discover the universe is expanding. You say, well, why should I look? The universe is as whatever God created. If you make the assumption that the universe can be explained by naturalistic methods, you come up with a lot. It doesn't mean that you have to say that there's no God. God is the fundamental entity which created the universe, which designed the laws of nature, which brought it all into play in order to produce what's there. They're absolutely not contradictory in any way. If you look at things from the religious perspective, you will say the purpose of the universe possibly or probably involved the creation of humanity and the emergence of humans as moral entities who are capable of understanding choices between good and evil and making a free will choice between them. You'll have a totally different picture of the universe. Now, altogether, I would say that there are different conceptions of how we can look at the universe. Do we want to look at the universe in a naturalistic way, explaining it with equations and leaving out anything to do with mind, spirituality, art, literature, anything else? Do we want to have a theory which is based only on observation, what can be proven? What is objective in the sense that, as I mentioned before, wherever you're from, whatever you believe, one can do an experiment and prove that this prediction is correct, this measurement is correct. If you want to limit yourself to that, you can come up with incredible things. All of science today is built on that foundation. And so is this incredible idea of the Big Bang, which has been verified experimentally. It's an amazing way to discover a certain aspect of truth about the universe. It's clear if you build a light, you know something about electricity, you know something about light. That's clear. I mean, people who built that obviously got something right. And if you build rockets that go to the moon and go to other planets, you clearly know something about the moon and about the universe and so on. If you can predict that when you look out in a telescope, you will see the galaxy moving away, and predict how it will look when it's the further away and moving faster and so on, if you can predict something like that based on an equation, you certainly know something about the universe. You may be missing something very fundamental about the universe if you assume that somehow the implication of that is that humans are just incidental. You certainly may be misunderstanding how the universe came into being or why it came into being. God created Big Bang. God designed laws of nature. And God designed the whole universe in such a way that through these laws of nature, the universe would evolve in such a way that it would eventually produce human beings who would have a mind and would have a spiritual connection, would have free will, and be able to face moral challenges. Why did God create a Big Bang? Why did God design laws of nature? Why did God design the whole universe in such a way that through these laws of nature, the universe would evolve in such a way that it would eventually produce human beings who would have a mind and would have a spiritual connection, would have free will, and be able to face moral challenges? You're missing the point. But if you understand that science is limiting itself very much to all the things that I mentioned, a naturalistic, reductionist view of the universe, where you're limiting yourself only to those things that everyone can independently verify, you have some aspect of understanding of the universe. If you then complement that with the understandings that come through religion, through revelation and tradition, then you can have a more